The Atmosphere of Heaven, that was the young poet Robert Southey's description of his first airbag of nitrous oxide, which was given to him by the young chemist Humphrey Davy at the Pneumatic Institution in Hotwells in 1799. That was where nitrous oxide was first inhaled. They were the first people to try it. The Pneumatic Institution was probably the first example of what we now call a medical research institution, a place specially set up to develop and test new chemical therapies. So in that sense it was set up to expect the unexpected, but nitrous oxide was really unexpected because this was a gas which didn't even exist in nature, which had just suddenly appeared, and yet it had incredibly powerful effects, very powerful physical effects. One lungful and people would kind of get dizzy and faint or have weird muscle spasms, but the physical effects were nothing compared to the mental effects, which were really intense. Most people who inhaled it just got this sudden, really powerful sort of rush of euphoria, and then on top of that, really bizarre sort of psychic effects where they felt like they were having a great sort of moment of cosmic revelation and the secret of the universe was suddenly made plain. So this was a very, very exciting discovery. I mean, first of all, because it was this gas that turned out to have such powerful physical effects that it obviously had great medical capabilities, but also beyond the medical capabilities were the philosophical implications of it, that the highest sort of reaches of the human mind and the human imagination could be stimulated just by a lungful of artificial gas. What did that say about, life? So this was so the Pneumatic Institute were very, very excited by this discovery, but they found it very hard to explain to the outside world. Doctors, for various reasons, including, as we'll see, political reasons, were not very interested in trying it out. It was very hard to get society at large to engage with these kind of bigger philosophical questions of what this all really meant. The only level on which it really caught the public imagination was, next slide please, was this. By about 1820, nitrous oxide had become a staple of kind of public entertainments in sort of very kind of low-class forums like sort of Variety and Music Hall, and that's where it first got its enduring nickname of laughing gas. So a laughing gas show was kind of like a precursor of the stage hypnotism shows today. An experimenter would get up on stage and give a sort of pseudo-scientific lecture about it, which would always mention the Pneumatic Institution, because by this time Robert Southey was the poet laureate, Humphrey Davy was Sir Humphrey, President of the Royal Society, so these were names to conjure with. But basically after that people would get up on stage to inhale a bag of nitrous oxide and then be encouraged to act out the moment of intoxication and disinhibition, which they do kind of by singing or dancing or fighting or quite often just laughing. Laughing gas shows turned out to be particularly popular in America on the carnival circuit, because this was the time when these big carnivals could just tour around the States and you could play sort of years and years on end, kind of one small town after another without ever sort of crossing a step. So there was these American carnivals quite often had nitrous oxide shows. So, for example, Samuel Colt, before he invented the mass-produced revolver, toured a nitrous oxide show around New England in a tent which he had kind of emblazoned on the front the Robert Southey quote, "The atmosphere of heaven must be composed of this gas." So this was obviously a very different outcome from what the Pneumatic Institute had hoped. But it was, curiously, the avenue through which nitrous oxide would turn out to revolutionise medicine. Because among the people who came to see nitrous oxide carnival shows were doctors and particularly dentists, and what they noticed straight away was that after people had had a lung full of nitrous oxide, they could, they quite often stumble around and bump into things, and they could actually hurt themselves quite badly and not feel any pain at all. So dentists then started offering nitrous oxide for sort of pain-free dental extractions, and that was the way that it made its way into medicine, and then revolutionised medicine with pain-free surgery, and a new word, anaesthesia, was coined to describe its effects. So that's kind of the context in which the Pneumatic Institute has been remembered, but what I want to do briefly here is to go back and have a bit more of a look at what they were really up to. So, next slide. And that all starts with this man. This is Dr. Beddoes, Thomas Beddoes, and who was an extraordinary character. He was much larger than that. That's a very flattering portrait. He was kind of very short and almost circular, and incredibly energetic character. He was the son of a tanner from Shropshire, incredible prodigy and polymath. And at the time he came up with the idea for the Pneumatic Institute, which was around 1790, he was teaching chemistry at Oxford University. And very successfully, he was one of the leading chemists in the country, and he was in line to become the first professor of chemistry at Oxford. But there were various reasons why Oxford was not for him. The first one was politics. Beddoes had always been a sort of progressive political reformer, and after the French Revolution, which he supported very vocally, very enthusiastically, he became a very conspicuous outsider in Oxford, which, like all of British society, became much more conservative, really swung to the right after the French Revolution. So by sort of 1792, 1793, he was on a lot of Home Office lists as a subversive and British Jacobin and so on. Also, sort of chemistry and the sciences that he was teaching at Oxford. Oxford didn't take those subjects very seriously. Beddoes had just started to teach geology. He was kind of one of the few people wandering around at this point who knew perfectly well that the Earth was billions and billions of years old, and you still couldn't say anything that conflicted with the biblical chronology, so he was kind of running out of road with his discipline as well. But also, he wasn't really an academic. The thing that had always motivated him from an early age had been medicine. And the reason he gave for that was, a very simple one, that what was the point of learning, he said, unless, it's to improve the condition of mankind and make the world a better place. And, the most efficient and effective way of doing that with learning was medicine. So what he started to do, where the idea of the Pneumatic Institute came from, was the idea of pushing chemistry, and particularly gas chemistry, which was a sort of very new and exciting aspect of chemistry, putting that together with medicine. He was aware at this point that the most dangerous and sort of problematic diseases, and the most urgent medical cause was lung diseases, tuberculosis, but also miner's lung and other occupational diseases. He was one of the first doctors to notice that factory towns in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were producing a whole new sort of raft of occupational diseases that needed to be treated. And he figured out, there were no kind of death statistics or anything at this time, but he figured out that about 1 in 4 British people died of a lung complaint. So he started to put this together with the science of gases. Oxygen had been discovered by Joseph Priestley about 20 years before. It had been demonstrated to be kind of very health-giving. So he started to think, what are all the other gases that are out there that nobody's synthesized, that nobody's experimented with, and that might be really helpful in treating lung conditions, things like consumption and tuberculosis. Because at that time, the only therapy that really worked, and where the entire medical profession was concentrated, was on the wealthy, because there was only private medicine, so most doctors didn't bother with anything except wealthy people. Wealthy people could go abroad, they could go to the Alps, they could go to the Mediterranean, they could inhale good air, and that would quite often cure their diseases. But as Beddoes kept pointing out, that we're talking about contagious diseases here, or occupational diseases. The reservoir for these is in the slums and in the cities and in the docks. So, these people can't go to the Alps. So why don't we try and synthesize, if there's something good in the air there, why don't we try and create that in the laboratory, and then we can take it to where it's needed and treat the people who need it most. So that was the idea, and he was casting around for somewhere to do this. He'd never really been to Bristol before, but he was looking for a particular conjunction of things. He needed somewhere which had a wealthy clientele, so he could practice medicine for wealthy people and make enough money to fund this. Then he also needed someone with a population of what he called the sick and drooping poor, you know, poor sort of downtrodden people with chronic illnesses. And there were plenty of those in Bristol, you know, because the area around the docks, you know, was very poor. And there was also in Hotwells, there was a spa, which people with chronic and terminal, you know, consumption and other conditions would come and visit. So he decided to leave the university and to start up his own private charitable institute here in Bristol. So next slide. This is where he settled, and this is where the walk that we're going to do tomorrow morning kicks off. This is in Clifton, in Rodney Place. So he arrives here in the beginning of 1793, just at the time when Bristol is entering a very unusual and very intense period of civil strife. Britain's just declared war on France, so all the ports are blockaded. So there's a huge economic slump, people being laid off all over the place, and big rifts opening up between the elite in Bristol, the Bristol Corporation and the Society of Merchant Venturers, who control all the trade and control the stocks in the warehouses, and the rest of the population, and these tensions that exploded at the end of 1793 in the Bristol Bridge riots, which started with the new toll gates for the new bridge in Bristol being burnt down, and then ended with out-of-town militias firing on unarmed crowds and killing 10 people. So from this point on, Beddoes was wherever he lived, he always kind of got engaged in local political activism, whatever it was. And in Bristol, it was campaigning against the war with France, campaigning for peace, campaigning against the slave trade, running networks for distributing ethical products, you know, boycotting sugar and, you know, sort of selling ethical maple syrup to replace it and that kind of thing. And in that sort of milieu of political agitation, he met, that's where he met Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey and these poets who were young radicals at the time, although when they got famous later on, they denied it all. And Rodney Place is where that happened. So this was kind of, from the moment Beddoes moved in, you know, he never left until he died. This was the sort of centre of a kind of salon and social scene that included poetry and medicine and science and philosophy and politics. A kind of really interesting, progressive cultural scene that unlike anything that had ever been seen in Bristol before. Next one. So that was his base. What he was trying to do was to get the Pneumatic Institute together, and there was a lot that needed to be done, because his idea, once he thought about it, it involved two things that had never been put together before. One was a chemical laboratory, and the other was a clinic where you could treat patients. And it wasn't obvious how these two went together, because gases you had to make with kind of dangerous toxic chemical reactions in crucibles with naked flames. It's not the kind of thing you want to do next to kind of seriously sick patients. So Beddoes enlisted the help of the nation's foremost engineer, the now semi-retired James Watt, up in Birmingham, whose own daughter had just died of consumption, and he gave his time free to produce, without making any sort of patent claims, as a charitable initiative, this device. This is basically, that's a crucible in which you put different elements and chemicals depending on what gas you want to produce. Put a fire underneath it, so the gas goes off down the tube, it goes into that little sort of water trough where it's cooled and impurities are cleansed out of it, and then that's a gas bellows at the end, and that kind of rises and falls with the pressure like a sort of big gas tank. And James Watt's design meant that that had like a little tap, a little spigot off the side, so you could take a sort of airbag and fill it up with gas and then take the airbag over to the patient. Beddoes loved this device. He was absolutely convinced that every home, you know, within 10 years, every home was going to have one. It's like a kitchen stove. Everybody would just be making all their own gases for medical purposes. So he was busying himself with that, but Bristol was also, like the rest of the country, riding into a real political storm, and by 1795 Beddoes found himself having to drop everything because it was all hands to the pumps for political activity. The Pitt government was sort of ratcheting up the war with France, more and more conscription, more and more food shortages. There were sort of riots breaking out all over the country, even in Bristol. You know, Bristol hadn't had food riots for many, many decades at this point. Bristol was, you know, a very easy city to keep fed because it was a port and a docks. You know, you could just requisition grain, but the and food stocks, you know, unlike a lot of other big industrial centres. But the Bristol Corporation were reluctant to do that, so there were jobbers, middlemen coming in, buying the stocks and selling them out of town for higher prices. This was a kind of pattern that was happening all over Britain and leading to you know, more and more dissent and protest against the war, culminating in the summer of 1795 with a huge London Corresponding Society rally in St George's Fields outside London with delegates from all over the country, 100,000 people. More and more visible protest, the King's carriage being stormed, Pitt's windows in Downing Street being smashed by mobs. And then at the end of 1795, the government responded with two incredibly draconian bills, which became known as the gagging bills. The first one basically redefined any form of political dissent as sedition and treason, and the second one made any unauthorised gatherings of over 50 people illegal. So the protests against this in Bristol were led by Beddoes and a few other people who stormed the Guildhall and commandeered it for a big debate. Beddoes produced a fantastic pamphlet called Defence of the Bill of Rights against the Gagging Bills, which is kind of one of the great civil liberty pamphlets of the time. And it was a couple of years after that before you know, sort of war continued and you know, the protests dissipated. And Beddoes had always slightly felt it was kind of indecent in times when there was sort of real starvation to be asking for charitable money for a medical research institute. It took him a couple of years before things eased, and he got a couple of big financial donations, and he was able to proceed and actually get the institute off the ground. Next slide. Yeah, this is where the story becomes famous and iconic. This is Humphrey Davy looming over his hometown of Penzance, though in real life he was actually really very small. And he was a chemical prodigy in his teens at this time, who had been discovered by a friend of Beddoes' down in Cornwall called Davis Giddy, who was a very interesting character. He'd originally been a chemistry student at Beddoes' at Oxford. They shared the same politics, but Giddy back in Cornwall had got roped into being a county sheriff, so he was kind of, on the one hand, you know, reading his Tom Paine and waving it about in public, you know. And on the other hand, he was the person who had to call county militias out to sort of, you know, stop looting and put down riots. Next slide. And he found that here. This is in Dowry Square in Hotwells. So this is like the top left-hand corner of the square as you look up from Hotwells Road. You can see it's got a yard out the back for sort of deliveries and chemical stuff. And that was where Davy lived, up on the top floor. They kitted it out, and by the beginning of 1799, it had been they opened up the Pneumatic Institute as a charitable hospital for anybody who had persistent and chronic diseases of the lung or other sort of chronic conditions that they couldn't get treated, to come and get treated for free by Davy and Beddoes. That happened in a clinic down there on the ground floor. And then after clinic hours, Beddoes and Davy would be in the laboratory at the back, just synthesising all the different gases they could think of and testing them. And within a few weeks, Davy had synthesised nitrous oxide, and they kind of inhaled it and realised that it was the one. You know, this was like the sort of discovery that they'd, sort of blue skies discovery that they had in mind. And But they didn't test it on patients. Beddoes was very reluctant to, he said, basically, these people have come here to be cured, they've not come here to be experimented on, so let's just give them conventional therapies for a while until they trust us, and then we'll see if these drugs like nitrous oxide work for them. But in the meantime, there was such a lot that could be established about nitrous oxide by testing it on healthy people. So that was the sort of scene of the nitrous oxide experiments here, and I guess you have to imagine May, June of 1799, the sort of summer evenings getting longer, and after surgery hours, then the sort of progressive and radical Bristol doctors and poets and lawyers and philosophers all kind of trooping up to the first floor to inhale nitrous oxide as part of Davy's experiments. So Davy would get this ammonium nitrate reaction going and produce the gas, and he'd give people a little lecture about it, and then people would inhale nitrous oxide and see what happened. And it became this kind of incredible sort of unpredictable scene where some people would just sort of start talking gibberish, other people would just run up and down stairs and then have no recollection of what they'd done. Other people would feel they were floating up to the ceiling. Everybody, after they'd had their nitrous oxide, Davy made them write like a little description of their effects, and he included that all in his report, which was the work that was going to make his name. By the end of the summer, most people had come and they'd had their few sort of bags of nitrous oxide, and they'd written their reports and they'd moved on to other things. But Davy was still seriously into it and still taking more and more, trying to, on the one hand, trying to figure out all the sort of chemical and medical questions that it posed, but also just getting really into the thing and kind of pushing it and taking it further and further. He realised that the brilliant thing about the airbag meant that you could take airbags full of nitrous oxide away, so he'd take them down to hot wells and up the Avon Gorge, particularly on nights when there were full moons, and he'd kind of sit up there kind of overlooking the Avon with his big bags of nitrous oxide and his sort of notebook, kind of inhaling and writing poetry. And then he was joined in the autumn in what had become a solitary quest by another person who turned out to be his most significant companion. Next slide. This is Coleridge, who'd just come back from Germany, where he'd been for the last year or so. And you notice as soon as Coleridge showed up, he'd been reading all this kind of German idealist philosophy. He got into this idea that reality is actually all created in the mind by the imagination, and you can see Davy starting to really get into this, and his notebooks and his work start sort of taking on that cast. And his most famous description of nitrous oxide is of the sort of final, biggest experiment which he did on Boxing Day, 1799. James Watt had built this device, which was kind of like a sedan chair inside a kind of panelled cabinet. And the idea was that this would be for patients who were very, very weak and who couldn't, hold a balloon or a tube to their lips. You could sit them in the chair in the cabinet and feed gas into them. So Davy, stripped to the waist, thermometer under his arm, sat in the cabinet, got someone to pump nitrous oxide into it constantly for an hour, and then kind of stepped out and inhaled like 10 quarts of nitrous oxide, one after the other. And then got into this state where, as he describes it in his report, nothing exists but thoughts. He entered this sort of whole new world where all there were was ideas and impressions, and this was kind of, so it wasn't reality that created ideas, it was ideas that created reality. And that's one of the things that for me is so interesting about the nitrous oxide experiments, is that they mirror that particular time so amazingly well. Because it starts off with Beddoes as this sort of classic Enlightenment project. It's all about making the world a better place and trying to figure out how to improve the lot of mankind. And it ends up with this radical sort of subjectivity, of people getting sort of lost, in their own worlds, the sort of beginning of the Romantic movement. So after the nitrous oxide experiments were published, Davy was headhunted by all kinds of prestigious institutions, and he jumped ship and took up a job at the Royal Institution in London. He wrote to his mother, "You'll be very glad to see me getting among the Royalists." He was very career-minded. He was sort of the Tony Blair of chemistry, I think, and he'd realised that this network of provincial radicals was not going to do his career any good in the long run. So he went to London And one of the first things he did at the Royal Institution was a nitrous oxide show. Next slide. So that's this is the most famous image of the nitrous oxide experiments. So that's Humphrey Davy with the Beddoes. He's a sort of kind of uncouth rustic kind of at the back, and these are all the great and good of the London scientific world, all sort of making idiots of themselves, is the general thrust of this caricature. But it's a bit of a shame that that's the only image, because that's the only time that nitrous oxide experiments happened in that sort of London milieu, and there's no visual record of what it all looked like here down in Hotwells, which was right at the other end of the spectrum. But Beddoes stayed in Bristol, and he gradually accepted that the medical profession was not going to buy his idea of nitrous oxide or sort of gases in medical therapy. But what he did was then return to his original mission, which was to treat the sick and drooping poor, as he called them. In fact, he renamed the Pneumatic Institute the Institute for the Treatment of the Sick and Drooping Poor. And by 1804, 1805, he had literally thousands of patients coming mostly from the sort of docks area of Bristol. So he opened up another clinic there to reflect the fact that most of his clientele was no longer the invalids from Hotwells, He was a real pioneer at this time of preventive medicine, because doctors were so expensive and hospitals were so untrustworthy and sort of full of contagious diseases. The best thing for people who couldn't afford doctors was just to was to learn how to look for the early signs of diseases and learn how to how to prevent them. So he wrote endlessly sort of pamphlets about that, and ended up with thousands of patients. And Bristol ended up with a much lower rate of tuberculosis consumption than it had before. It was kind of very modest in comparison with Davy and Coleridge and all the other sort of stellar figures who went on to sort of deny their radical past and become big sort of famous establishment figures. Beddoes stuck it out in Bristol and died in 1808. Next slide. Largely forgotten. That is, as we'll see tomorrow on the walk, that is pretty much all you can make out on Beddoes' gravestone these days. And that last summer I had to clear with a shovel for a while before you could even see there was a gravestone there at all. So next slide. 50 years later, once Victorian gentlemen had started ironing each other's faces, once anaesthesia had been discovered, then that was what the Pneumatic Institute became. It just became this footnote in the sort of history of anaesthesia. But I think there was a lot more to it than that, and I've tried to give you a brief sense of that today. So thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
The drop in tuberculosis deaths in Bristol, how is that comparable with other cities?
It was tuberculosis carried on sort of going up and up, and so Bristol was kind of was conspicuously less of it. It's very hard. I mean, this is kind of one of Beddoes' things. There wasn't really anybody doing the official counting at this point, he was a great campaigner for nobody should be buried without a kind of cause of death and everything, because we've got to know who's dying of what diseases, because otherwise we can't assess whether preventive medicine is working or not. So he was always doing spot surveys around the place, and he was always his ledgers recorded details of his patients and how much consumption there was, and he was always going around asking. And the only other person who was doing anything like that at the time was Edward Jenner, who was going around here doing all smallpox vaccination as well. So between the two of them, that's the whole idea of preventive medicine really got going. And then his last thing really he wrote before he died was to the Joseph Banks, the president of the Royal Society, kind of with his recommendations for reforming the medical profession, which was all about, we've got to get a decent set of statistics going. There's just so many doctors wandering around with their anecdotal remedies and anecdotal facts, and nobody's feeding it into a central bank. So, that was, he kind of anticipated a lot of the changes in the medical profession, like the next generation.
He continued to use nitrogen oxide until his death.
Yeah, he's kind of he carries on saying, like a letter to he stops trying to convince people of it, you know, that it's working, but he does kind of write to James Watt kind of just before his death saying, you know, I know perfectly well that nitrous oxide is an amazing substance, and I know perfectly well it's going to find a medical application and it's going to revolutionise medicine, and I don't recant from any of that at all. So, yeah, he was a bit scared about using it because he was so sort of big and fat. You know, Davy was kind of young and was like really up for kind of, you know, chugging down as much as he possibly could. Beddoes was a bit sort of worried that, you know, because it made his sort of heart pitter-patter a bit, you know, and all that, so he only sort of took it in moderation. But he writes kind of really beautifully about it. He was really brilliant at describing medical conditions. Like before you had a diagnosis, it was all about how well you could describe stuff. So his descriptions of all these different diseases are really good. His descriptions of his own nitrous oxide highs are really great. He says it's like being bathed all over with a bucket of good humour, you know. And he sort of, you know, how, you know, you know, he feels like he's walking on air for hours afterwards, and you know, feels like he's going around with sort of his eyes twinkling, and everybody's going, "Are you drunk?" You know, and he's going, "No, no."
Well, you tried ether. Was ether around?
Yeah, ether was around, and he was quite big into ether. He prescribed ether. He prescribed ether to Southey, actually. He was. He thought ether was good for sort of panic attacks, which it sort of was. He had a big thing about hypochondria, which nobody else had really recognised as a disease. But Beddoes was always saying that the trouble with the middle classes, they've got too much time on their hands, you know, they've got too much money, you know, they convince themselves they're ill, and then they kind of want all these medicines, and they go to doctors, and kind of doctors are just experts at saying, oh, you've got to have this, and you've got to have that. So there's actually like a real problem with all these nervous patients, and who think they've got diseases that they haven't. Robert Southey was like that. He kept convincing himself that, you know, he was about to have a heart attack and everything, and Beddoes would go, just have some ether, yes. Just have a few huffs on that and you'll calm down. So he was one of them. Yeah, he and Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who was, he and Beddoes were kind of good friends. They were both real pioneers in the use of ether and opium as well. You know, opium was one of the few useful remedies as far as they were concerned, and they both prescribed it to Coleridge. That turned out a bit bad.
How come they haven't banned it?
Nitrous oxide? That's a good question, isn't it?
Catering industry.
The thing is, well, there's so many. There's the catering industry, you know, there's the sort of most, I mean, basically it's got lots of industrial applications. There are lots of things that would be, you know, it would be annoying for lots and lots of kind of people in lots and lots of industries if you couldn't get hold of it at all.
A bit like banning glue.
Yeah, exactly. But what they've done is they've kind of sort of regulated it, haven't they? The sort of Medicine and Healthcare Regulation Authority. You're supposed to, you know, if you're a catering shop and you sell it to somebody who's like obviously going to use it for inhaling, then you know you can be done for that. Is that right? That hasn't happened yet. Actually. But also the other thing is, you know, let's be frank, it's pretty harmless. You know, people are not kind of dropping like flies in nitrous oxide abuse.
What did Beddoes think of the influence of the German idealism?
He sort of didn't really get the point of it to start off with. He didn't have a lot of patience with philosophy, was Beddoes' thing. You know, once it got all too abstract, he sort of lost interest. So he was quite into sort of the British empirical philosophy. He was really people like Hume and Locke, you know, and he was happy to say, okay, world is just like as I perceive it. You know, I can't do any better than that, and you know, there is no reality. All I know is what my senses tell me, and that's fine. You know. And the sort of idealist philosophy was about saying, oh no, but you know, there is this other reality that lies behind that, and blah blah blah. And, actually, Kant was quite a fan of Beddoes. Beddoes wrote lots of essays about consumption and tuberculosis, which Kant read and really liked. And Beddoes reviewed Kant in London Journal and said, you know, he writes about really interesting stuff, but I wish that he was not so utter a stranger to clarity.
And Kant didn't like it,
Not as far as I know. They would have, the German idealists would have really liked it, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Good, gone. If you're around tomorrow morning, it'll be a lovely day, and we'll tramp round. We'll start at Rodney Place, which is just off, Clifton Down Road, and then we'll go down to Dowry Square and the site of the Pneumatic Institute, and we've got the special secret key to the Strangers' burial ground down on Clifton Hill, where Beddoes is buried. So that's 12 o'clock tomorrow if you're about. Thanks very much indeed.